Well, we'll get started.
Sure.
And this is Gerry rising, and he has given me this because this is going to put it all in a nutshell much easier than I could say it myself. Okay. Today our speaker is Gerry Rising, a man who has served 57.5 months of incarceration for crimes involving embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud. He has written a memoir entitled Unjust, a law-abiding businessman's tragic quest for due process, which he describes in his words. How in spite of his innocence, he was forced to accept a plea deal with his federal prosecutors. Kind of everybody's worst nightmare, you know, things that you think can't happen, can happen. After almost 30 years of successful entrepreneurship in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, serving client employees in a 6-state area, in 2010, Mr. Rising found himself driven to unexpected bankruptcy. The bankruptcy left many plan participants of his employer-based health plan administration enterprise stranded and in financial peril. By his count, $1,900,000 in claims were left unpaid. The Denver Post immediately produced several days of highly inflammatory front-page, above-the-fold headlines highlighting the condition of the plan participants while hinting that there was foul play committed by Mr. Rising. Once described in the press as an alleged villain, the Denver U.S. Attorney's Office then made Rising an official target. What happened thereafter is described in detail in his memoir. In this book, he illustrates quite vividly how the judicial process is not all what the average citizen, let alone a reasonably sophisticated entrepreneur, expects to encounter. He has seen it all, not only from his personal involvement, but more importantly from the vantage point of his fellow travelers. I urge you to listen carefully to the lessons learned from Gerry's journey. And I want you all to welcome Gerry. And really, he just happened to be in the library. I've kind of known he and his wife casually for years. And we were talking probably about my daughter as a public defender, and he just shared a little bit about his little ordeal, and I just thought it would be interesting to share this with you guys, and I'm really appreciative that he was willing to come and talk to us today. So, sit back and enjoy.
Thank you.
Well, it sounds like 50 people clapping. My wife Linda and I, we live here. We live up in Trace Valleys. We've been up there since 2007. And every morning we look out over the valley and the Spanish Peaks. And anyway, we just love this area and love the people. And we survived the fire. I hope you all survived the fire. Perhaps not all of you did, but you know, it kind of feels like we're all back in business, and you know, the life goes on, and anyway. Now, having somebody like me speak, you know, somebody who's been in prison, a convicted felon, a money launderer, you know, I know that's tough to take for some people. I hope by the time I'm done today, though, if you feel any trepidation in that regard, I'm not here to espouse my innocence. You'll have to read the book for that. But I'm here to talk about the different people I encountered along my journey. And I think from that, there's more lessons learned. Okay, now, before I get going today, I want to first make a comment to the victims of the demise of my business, particularly the many plan participant victims. I'm very sorry. I know I let you down. I think about that every day. You probably will not believe this, but I tried to do what was right to make you whole, but was blocked by the system. What you don't know is that others you were depending on let you down as well. I believe your interests were not properly represented and would be very willing to support any contestment against your supposed representatives. If you know someone who might have been victimized, and I had 2 clients over in the San Luis Valley, probably 40 people, 50 people. If you know someone who might have been victimized, please pass my comments along. And for that matter, I can give you my contact information and all that. I'd really like to talk to some of these people. You will be relieved I'm not here today to focus on espousing my innocence. You'll have to read my book to appreciate that. I'll just say this about my personal experience. If you were to read only the media articles found on the internet, the depictions in the Denver Post particularly, I expect you will be convinced of my guilt. Reading those things, I'd be convinced of my guilt. But by reading my memoir, and I've got extra copies if anyone wants to purchase, that's my advertisement. But by reading my memoir with all the footnotes and exculpatory documentation, my hope is you will see how our system of judging guilt and innocence simply does not perform with any level of fair-mindedness, or even in a just constitutional way. Before my incarceration, I held a view of the justice system that I now know, dreadfully naive. I was not much aware of the level of improper behavior routinely exhibited by a good many lawyers and investigators serving within our system. I had this feeling that I got smothered while most others did not. I still thought most were treated fairly. Believe me, my first year in prison, an epiphany of sorts, there were so many stories of similar crushing abuse, I began to fully appreciate how widespread these unfair convictions were occurring. I was not alone, as I had previously thought. I entered prison, a minimum security federal camp in Canyon City, by the way, housing 550 inmates, well, in Florence, Colorado. Sort of like a suburb of Canyon City. Not much of one, but life in the camp, while more safe than the prisons holding violent criminals, should not be construed as a white-collar paradise in any way, sometimes mockingly referred to as Club Fed. It's not a good place. There were no golf courses or swimming pools. They did have a track. They had an area where you could exercise, but it was a pretty stark environment, believe me. Within our inmate population, we had mostly drug offenders, I'd say 70%. Dirty law enforcement officers, corrupt politicians, nonviolent gun people, another 15%, along with my white-collar group consisting of, yet again, 15%. Within my group, we had doctors, lawyers, hedge fund managers, mostly small-time, mortgage brokers, again low-level, and a small smattering of insurance types like me. One of the first things I found is there were almost no big guys, the kind you find on Wall Street. Everyone was like me, relatively small time, having created some level of substantial non-liquid wealth. In my case, my enterprise had been worth something approaching $25 million. Typically, we would lose what little liquidity was left to our attorneys and through government forfeiture. Sure, there was the rare governor, the once-in-a-while substantial head fudge manager who would retain considerable wealth, but I'm telling you, the vast majority became broke like me, having lost assets in the middle of their defense effort and then forced or coerced into accepting a plea deal. We, for the most part, had to fund our defense by personal means with no corporate or political donor funding. If we didn't, then we had to rely on either an overworked public defender or a minimally paid court-appointed attorney. Some appeared guilty as sin, but a surprising number, about half, seemed either outright innocent or incarcerated for crimes prison did not warrant. In fact, that's kind of the focus of where I'm going here. As an example, early on I encountered two young micro-entrepreneurs, young family men basically owning businesses consisting of a pickup truck and another worker who had stolen rocks in two different national parks, one apiece. They were not related, and they received 6 to 12-month sentences. One had actually innocently entered into a discussion with the park ranger explaining how he was returning one rock to retrieve for another. Obviously, these young men were maximally lacking in sophistication, let alone any street sense, but here they were. At a cost of $20,000 to $35,000 a year to house these people, is the system now even rational from the point of view of the taxpayer? $25,000 for a rock? Whatever happened to a good old-fashioned butt chewing by either the federal law enforcement official or the judge, and then sentencing with a fine coupled with community service? Now, out of respect for your time, I will select only a few professional groups to illustrate these abuses. It seemed almost every mortgage broker was claiming his innocence. Each representation appeared credible, citing the notion they operated as they were directed by higher-ups, assuming their actions were well researched by corporate counsel and therefore proper. Is that not how most sales reps operate, trusting their company to not put them in any kind of an unethical or non-legal bind? I never heard of a mortgage broker charged for falsifying data or forging a signature as I had expected. Surely a few were guilty of some sort of malfeasance, but I must say the consistency of the depictions was compelling. The hedge fund people were often relatively small time like me. You know, we had no billionaires or people who had been billionaires at one time. We didn't have, we just didn't. Hedge fund people were relatively small time like me, having been in most cases first defrauded by a third party, then continuing to live in a law-abiding way, only now with the damage, attempting to rectify the loss by filling the void over time. Each time they had another subsequent catastrophic financial event occur where they ran out of cash and had to shut down. The feds would then initiate their targeting process and pick up the case, looking for any possible chargeable offense, even if it had nothing to do with the underlying behavior that brought the target to their attention. In each case, it seemed obvious that the feds should have targeted the original third-party swindler rather than our hedge fund guy. The decision-making process was simply unfair, seemingly unfair in virtually every case. The doctors represented an interesting lot. Some were in for prescription fraud, while the others were incarcerated for Medicare or Medicaid abuse with their billings. A few were indeed bad characters, but the rest had me scratching my head. I had a cellmate for a time, a family doctor, a very good man. Not a shyster in any way. He was too naive to be a shyster. He was what you dream about in, a good doctor. The DEA agents found him to have committed 2 episodes of overprescribing oxycodone. It was a case involving less than 100 doses of alleged overprescribing on just 2 people. In each case, the patients had transferred from another doctor in another state. He had checked with what he thought were the previous physicians and was convinced these 2 patients were not fraudulent abusers, where they legitimately needed relief for debilitating pain. The feds thought otherwise. He had been president of his local medical society, and they wanted to make an example with his 3-year sentence. Sure, some of these stories may have been exaggerated or even untrue, but so many were compelling, like my good doctor friends. Clearly, he was not a criminal. In fact, he practiced probably 100 miles from here. He's in the mountains. Some of the doctors, particularly the Medicare and Medicaid fraud types, had very long sentences, 12 to 20 years. This was all based upon the unproven loss, not the charge, calculated by the feds and recommended to the sentencing judge. Unbeknownst to many of us, we were not aware of the abuse of calculating incarceration time based upon the unsubstantiated loss rather than the actual crime until we started serving time. The way it worked was the federal investigators would first find a fraudulent billing, most likely a legitimate chargeable fraud, and then extrapolate that to all his previous Medicare and Medicaid billings, assuming all were dirty, which they probably were mostly not. In effect, trumpeting a puffed up, unproven loss amount to secure a maximum sentence. Nuance or even the true facts were never considered. We had one surgeon, Harvard trained with a very impressive medical pedigree, who had fraudulently invoiced Medicare in certain situations. He readily admitted to it. By his calculation, he could show something like $500,000 emanating from his misdeeds, a big number by any stretch of one's imagination. The feds in this case, with their impossible to fathom extrapolations, puffed his loss amount to over $60 million, necessitating a very long sentence, 22 years, when the actual $500,000 fraud would have called under the sentencing guidelines for 2 years or less. You tell me, is this just? Like most white-collar criminals, I'm very confident that taken in the proper context, the numbers don't lie. Like most, I'm confident he would never again have committed this fraudulent billing practice regardless of his sentencing, whether it be 1 year or 20. There were so many countless abuses I learned of inflicted on my fellow travelers. Many were simply good men, smart men, even wise men, who either made a one-time mistake or in some cases were actually innocent. I state this with great confidence because I lived with these gentlemen for many years and grew to trust and accept their counsel. Some of the doctors, as an example, would operate as inmate medical advisors, filling a major void. Medical care dispensed by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons is generally very poorly administered. There are exceptions, though. I knew of inmates who died needlessly each year I was incarcerated due to lack of proper treatment. Lives were saved by these good men. Many of these same doctors would mentor the less educated, coaching inmates in some cases to not only achieve a GED certificate, but go on and receive an undergraduate college degree. I'm sorry, but bad people don't participate in these kinds of endeavors. Where am I going with all this? I first want you as citizens, as voters, to understand what has happened in our land, how the federal justice system has lost its way. I also want you to be prepared for the unexpected proverbial knock at your door, or perhaps that of a friend, of government investigators. Now this is very critical. With 4.4% of the world's population, the U.S. incarcerates at the federal, state, and local levels some 22% of the world's prison population. So we have this much in terms of the worldwide population and this much in terms of, it's incredible. We have the most detainees and the highest incarceration rate in the world. We incarcerate at a rate 5 times the worldwide average, 5 times that of Europe and Canada. Our 10-year recidivism rate approaches 70%, while the Europeans with far shorter sentences and comparable crime rates, although our murder rate is significantly higher, average 30%. 1 in 19 Americans, 5.1%, have either been incarcerated or will be incarcerated at some time in their life. For African, and that's just the general population. For African Americans, the stats are 5 times worse, 25% of that population. Hispanics, 3 times worse. Go to Google search and check these statistics out yourself. We incarcerate more than Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, even taken as a percentage. If we were to reduce our prison population nationally to the worldwide mean, that would involve releasing a stunning 80% of those now incarcerated. We know that will never happen, but if we shoot for 50%, I think that is a worthy goal. According to the Congressional Research Service, the number of inmates in federal prisons has swelled from 25,000 in 1980 to more than 200,000 in 2015, where taxpayer spending on federal inmates has swelled from $330 million to $7.5 billion over the same span. That's a little higher growth rate than the population growth. Is this how you want your federal dollars spent? Why is this? We have nowadays far too many innocent citizens finding their way to prison. By my count, about 10%. Although some credible experts have it as high as a third. Another 40% committed nonviolent acts, in many cases very minor infractions, where incarceration is not appropriate or even constructive. One interesting stat is that the recidivism rate among white-collar felons, close to my heart, who serve time is more or less equal to those who are not incarcerated. So incarceration has no, limited or minimal effect. Our federal prosecutors have an unbelievably absurd high conviction rate, 95%, of securing convictions on individuals mainly through pleas. The European countries and Canada, with their much more balanced approach to criminal justice, have conviction rates closer to 50%. The law and order movement carry a good amount of the responsibility, but unethical behavior exhibited throughout the legal community, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and even some judges, in my estimation, are most responsible. We have a compelling Constitution with our inalienable rights and protections supposedly guaranteed. A Constitution that stands as the model for the free world. Yet in practice, these protections are all too often ignored or interpreted so narrowly that many do not achieve what our forefathers, the writers of the Constitution, envisioned as just practice. 10 years ago, a distinguished criminal defense attorney, Harvey Silvergate, wrote a compelling, widely acclaimed book entitled 3 Felonies a Day. Harvey is both a protege and respected colleague of the famed Alan Dershowitz. Both men are thought of as highly admired advocates of the criminal justice reform movement. In his compelling volume, he describes brilliantly many of the standard, unseemly prosecutorial methods used to routinely abuse targets today. I won't cite all those misdeeds, but I find the genesis for the title most telling. It turns out there is a popular parlor game played by prosecutors across the country entitled 3 Felonies a Day, in which one prosecutor will throw out a public name, usually one who is thought of as righteous, like Mother Teresa, Abraham Lincoln, or Thurgood Marshall, where the other prosecutors in the room are then challenged to come up with at least 3 felonious crimes for which these good folks could be prosecuted. From his depiction, we can further appreciate the mindset of prosecutors, particularly the federal variety. They tend to be way too tough, way too strident. Collectively, they all too often ruthlessly ignore extenuating circumstances, even exculpatory evidence, virtually always securing their convictions through pleas with incarceration time. If you Google miscarriage of justice, and I encourage you to Google everything I'm saying here today. If you Google miscarriage of justice, you will find the following definition: a failure of a court or judicial system to attain the ends of justice, especially one that results in the conviction of an innocent person. People sometimes ask if I have respect for a particular prosecutor, U.S. attorney or attorney general. My standard response is, has this individual ever turned into a champion for a convicted target once exculpatory evidence came to light? Has he or she ever stood up and attempted to right any miscarriage of justice? If not, which is usually the case, I respond unequivocally that I believe that person to be unacceptable and most likely a moral coward. One of the critical tenets of criminal law, as supposedly practiced in the United States, is innocent until proven guilty. But in practice, in this day and age of mostly convictions mostly achieved via plea agreements, it is too often routinely ignored and given lip service only. You sometimes hear about various areas in which the criminal justice reform movement is moving. I don't want what I have to say here today as sounding partisan, espousing the ideals of one party over the other. I'm a libertarian Republican, but I readily admit that many Republicans are as ignorant and ineffective as a good number of Democrats in fostering the kind of change needed. Recently, we heard much of the passage of the First Step Act, which in part reauthorized the provisions of the previously enacted Second Chance Act, which were being ignored by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. It represents a fairly narrow set of sentencing reforms which will have only minimal impact, but at least it's a start. If it results in any more than a 2 or 3% reduction of the federal prison population, I would be surprised. In my criminal In my criminal justice reform world, due process reforms cry out just as much as sentencing reforms, which seems to catch most of the attention. In many of the states have been much more proactive, having now achieved a good 15 years of mostly prison reform, sentencing reform, and are performing a little more satisfactory. There's reason for hope. As an example, a decade ago, Texas, law and order, redneck Texas, famously reduced sentencing and then subsequently enjoyed a significant reduction in recidivism and overall crime in spite of their growing population. South Carolina, not exactly a liberal bastion, had a similar experience. So there's reason for hope. But at the federal level, there is much too much of what I describe as junk justice. My inmate comrades encountered it at virtually every turn. The Republicans tend to want to inflict over-the-top sentencing on drug people and illegal immigrants, while the Democrats seemingly refuse to consider any reform benefiting Anglo white-collar types like me, even though many know overzealous prosecutions represent a grave concern. Both parties are well aware of the statistics I have provided you today, demonstrating a wildly excessive conviction rate, yet no real success to date substantially ameliorating the problem. I think the answer is for all of us, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, to work within our alliances, examining the available data, attempting to achieve common ground between what is increasingly described as the most toxic political divide. Both sides need to stop, at least for a little while, the notion of crushing the opposite side at the expense of good public policy. It seems obvious to the solution to so many of these judicial reform issues should be a much more balanced process, strictly and broadly adhering to constitutional protections, coupled with much more behavioral-based rehabilitative care. We need much more psychological treatment, more drug treatment, and far shorter times of incarceration. Prisons are crime schools. People don't get reformed in prison. Prisons are basically crime schools. I learned so much about the drug business. It's appalling. The predominant result achieved by the current system is the hardening of criminal behavior, resulting in an alarming 70% recidivism rate. Sensible, thoughtful reforms could foster the reversal of this criminal contact, similar to the more productive practices found in many European countries, the most notable being Norway. That's another one you might want to Google. There is also a much more subtle political dimension, similar to profiling, which minorities often find themselves contending with. This one's prosecution by pretext, assuming a certain behavior is apparent and then criminality has occurred. In my case, the media and then the prosecutors decided the guy, me, went bankrupt, so he must have done something illicit. Where a cursory investigation occurs, exculpatory evidence brought to light by the defense is ignored, and then finally a conviction is attained by coerced plea. We should only target individuals where there is compelling evidence of wrongdoing, expecting the prosecutors to consider all the facts available, and then walk away if a prosecution is not warranted. In the plea bargaining arena, by far the most prominent method leading to convictions something like 98%. Judges, as a standard practice, should question all the evidence, particularly that associated with the loss amount calculation. There should be a requirement the courts objectively review the evidence proving the crime admitted to. Currently, this does not happen. The judges should have the prosecutors swear they considered all the facts, citing each individual detail, and then allow defense counsel to respond with no downside risk to the defendant emanating from the prosecution, such as reneging on a previously agreed to sentencing recommendation. This process could take as little as 15 minutes or as much as a day. The federal courts have the scheduling capacity to allow this more balanced approach. Since there are so few actual criminal trials, most of the time the federal courts are not even in session. Yet they sidestep this critical level of accountability by the prosecution. Lawyers in robes supporting lawyers in suits. The prosecutors all too often are given a free pass by the judges. The whole focus is on intimidating the target so he or she will not defend or appeal, even if they can or should. There must be balance with an eye toward protecting the prosecuted individual's rights. Pleas are not mentioned in the Constitution, but many other relevant protections are, including the right to effective counsel, the sanctity of contracts, due process, and the like. Let us enforce these protections as originally intended, not allowing the lawyers operating within the system to ignore critical facts. Finally, I haven't mentioned what I have come to appreciate in terms of my own personal growth. I learned that so many are far more unfortunate than me, thus harm more egregiously. I try to keep my dark chapter in perspective, a life lesson certainly, but not a total catastrophe. It is not a cancer or a death, even if for a time it felt that way. I'm a big believer in the old axiom, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. While away, I lost close friends and associates to illness, where I was able to persevere. I mourn their loss, but I'm grateful I am here today to relate what I observed to good folks like you. Without my experience, my dark chapter, I would not have this opportunity. For that, I am most grateful. Please read my book, and by the way, I gave Misty one that you can check it out from the library, or you can buy one from me today, or you can go to Amazon. If that means a group of you buy one copy and share, so be it. Most importantly, I want the world to know what I have seen, what my felon brothers have encountered, and what you might experience. If you have a friend who is currently targeted by the feds, I would be happy to offer non-legal guidance as to what might lie ahead. Thank you. And I would be honored to take any questions you might have.
When was this, Gerry? When were you incarcerated?
Well, the timeline, I went bankrupt in November 2010, was indicted April of 2011, sentenced April of 2012. And I got out in 2016, but I'm really not done with my sentence. I got out, went to a halfway house, which was far scarier than the prison camp. I had 2 murderers although I don't think they were that dangerous, but I had 2 murderers for roommates, and but anyway, fortunately I got out of there after 10 days, home confinement, and now I'm at the tail end of my 3 years of probation. And I'm looking forward to the end of February, so. Yes.
I have some comments that are germane, relevant, and profound.
Why, of course you do.
Well, given my family, it is. My grandfather was a heroin smuggler, convicted felon. My father was an embezzler, convicted felon. And I know mostly what you know by the time I was 16 years old, because I knew how it worked on a very intimate level. I went to high school with a guy named Neil Sonnet, who was, I believe, the assistant federal district attorney for South Florida. Neil was a superstar in college debating. I looked him up on the internet recently. He's one of the 10 best lawyers in America. He and I were fairly friendly. Back at that time, high schools had debating teams. Neil was a champion. I asked him one time what was his secret for winning. He looked me right in the eye and told me, "I lie. This is the man who became the assistant federal district attorney for South Florida."
Profound.
It is profound.
Profound.
How much do you think these prisons are being packed because a certain amount of them are privately owned, and so it's big business, and that's some of it. But now you weren't in a private. Were you in a private?
No. And private prisons
state.
are. I think I can cover.
Okay.
You sort of brought up two or three things. First of all, the private. You know, I'm a Republican. I always want to privatize all these government services, except for prisons. The problem, we had guys transfer in from some of these private prisons, and you know, we didn't like where we were at, but the things they would tell us about the private prisons, the guards, were, you know, probably 25% of our guards were, you know, Nazis. I don't know what else to.
No.
And the private prison, there's so little training that, you know, that kind of thing is greatly enhanced. And then finally, the food. We had kind of a varied menu. I mean, it was all cheap food all the time. Well, yeah, anything out of shingle. But the private prisons, it was rice and beans. And, you know, think about living off rice and beans and rice and beans, hot sauce, no hot sauce. You know, I have a hard time imagining going a week like that. And, you know, the guys are in there for pretty good sentences. So the only good thing about that, though, is those prisons, for some reason, were motivated to show that their guys were, they call it programming. And they were taking classes that the prison would offer, and those classes are just junk. There's no way anybody's behavior is changed by these classes. But anyway, they, well, rice and beans. Let's leave it at that.
Okay, rice and beans.
Yes, sir.
Well, since Richie just commented on the lying part, I wanted to follow that up by saying that I'm an old guy. I've done a lot of business type things, and so I've had my time in the courtroom, mainly for civil type stuff. And
Are you an attorney?
oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
No. And the thing that, I mean, I could tell you a lot of stories about different things, but just on the lie part, one thing I noticed was that the person who's innocent generally is not going to tell me lies. And yet the other person can say whatever he wants. It's just like the President of the United States. And so, and it's much more flexible. I mean, in other words, if you can lie, you have a lot more power and flexibility than you do if you have to tell the truth. And then the other thing I noticed was that people who lie, you know, oftentimes get caught in their lies, in the courtroom and other places too. Well, when they get caught, the judge doesn't bat an eyelash. I
Well,
mean,
it depends who.
I've never seen a perjury in any courtroom, and I guess the judges don't want to deal with it, or maybe they don't care. And so the dice are kind of loaded in the person, for the person who's dishonest.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
And I'll just finish it by saying that overall, I kind of look at the courtroom as the playground of the devil.
Yeah, that's a good description. You know, our whole justice system is geared towards seeking truth.
Supposed to be.
Yeah, and there's another thing. It's illegal to lie to a federal prosecutor, to a federal agent, prosecutors, investigators. So
But they can legally lie to you.
all day long, and they do. They do. You know, they come up with the false premise to try to draw you out.
Mark Furman from the O.J. Simpson trial called it test-lying.
Yeah. It's now at the state level, supposedly a good many states, and I don't know if Colorado is one. They can't put you in prison for not telling the truth to a federal investigator. But at the feds, they want to be the hardest, the strongest, most forceful. And but anyway, getting back to the truth. If you're going to a trial, which is very expensive, in my case they were quoting, $1 million and stuff like that. I'll just sit in jail for 5 years. I'm not spending, it would have ruined us to do something like that. So when you go to trial, though, and you have the wherewithal to spend that kind of money, or you have a dedicated public defender who's very willing to go to trial. They have these huge caseloads, and if they take time out for a 1-week trial, it kills the rest of their caseload, and so they're not too excited about that. But you go to trial, and the prosecution presents their narrative. And by the way, most of the time these narratives I read about in the newspaper, I don't know for sure, but they just strike me as over the top. It's sort of like they're too perfect. They put everything they could think of in there, and in my case, the narrative the government submitted to the court, about 90% of it was wrong. I won't call it lying. I'll just say it was wrong. And they knew it. Or at least 80% of it, I think they knew it. And I wasn't alone, right? I go to prison, I'm thinking, geez, I'm the only guy. I'm the most unlucky guy going, and then I go to prison and I meet all these people.
By law, the prosecution is supposed to disclose, it's called discovery, exculpatory evidence, and they routinely do not do that.
Exactly. That is so true. Yeah.
I've taken notice in previous cases that I've reviewed that there is a large amount of not what they call assumption in the courtroom by the prosecution. It's called inference. And inference is allowed a huge amount of latitude and it's not based on truth at all.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, there's different levels of hearsay, but in general, hearsay is, I wish they wouldn't rely on it. You're in a capital case or a criminal case, the jury's supposed to determine your guilt based upon reasonable doubt.
Right.
You know, so if you have like a 1% or 5% level of doubt in your head, the assumption is you're going to vote not to convict. But I don't think that happens. I was on a jury, 30 years ago. Yeah, 35 years ago. And it was a state case, and it involved an accountant who drove over by Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. At the time it was still operating. And he was drunk. Well, supposedly, according to the narrative, he was drunk and driving erratically. An airman, a military policeman, arrested him. And the case eventually ended in court, and we were on the jury. Well, shame on me. But I remember thinking, geez, this guy's just, everything the prosecution presented, the airman's training and all these different things. I just thought, no, this guy is definitely guilty. So we started, and I was the jury foreman, and we started, going around the room, what does everybody think? And most people were like me, hang 'em. And we got to this girl, and she said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. There's so much abuse out there. I don't believe anything that prosecution said. And the defendant, according to her, she thought he was a stand-up guy. And he could very well have been. Well, anyway, we jawed and debated, and finally we got her to convict. Well, now, 35 years later, I look back on that. That girl was right. Our son is a lawyer, and he's in the U.S. Army JAG. And where do I want to go with that? I'll save that for another question. Yes.
Yeah, two things related to this. One, sort of an anecdote. So it's in the 1980s, and we're at a party for the swim team that our daughter was swimming on. And then two of the parents were there, two fathers, started to talk, and they were both contractors. Hey, there's a big push going on for building private prisons. We need to cash in on this. There's a lot of money to be made here. And I go, where is this going to go if there's a profit motive? And so the rest is history. But the other thing I wanted to relate was I was on a grand jury in New Mexico for 6 months or a year. I can't remember what it was. And so I had to review a whole bunch of cases. And it was eye-opening in many ways. But one of the things that I left upset about was the fact that the pressures put by the prosecutors on the members of the grand jury, the
Really?
DA, assistant DA, and so you're in there. I remember one case in particular where there was a young server in a restaurant who served a client, served a patron, and it turned out that the patron was underage. Now, I don't know if he had a false ID or if the server failed to check the ID. It was in a Vietnamese restaurant. There were all sorts of mitigating circumstances why I thought that, this person shouldn't go to trial.
Good.
And one of the things that
Did you win?
No, I didn't. Okay, and one of the things that they do in New Mexico, and maybe this is common practice across the country, is what they'll do is they'll send a false patron in who's underage or has a false ID, and then someone in law enforcement to sit in another part of the restaurant or the bar, whatever, to observe what's going on. So this happened.
Entrapment.
It was entrapment,
Yeah.
and it's just common practice in all of, the restaurants and bars and so on. But this is a young kid who was, serving and this and that. And I argued against it, but boy, did the DA get upset with me. I mean, just hammering,
Really?
back off. And
You're the first person who's sat on a grand jury that I've been able to talk to, and this is very, very interesting.
I mean, most of the cases we had to deal with, and we reviewed testimony, and we had lots of witnesses come in, and things from like major, drug crimes, all sorts of things, where they were believable. This deserved to go to trial. But when they come to the grand jury, the pressure is to make a decision in favor of sending them into the trial.
Yeah, what percentage of the cases presented to you,
Went to trial,
or
deserves a clean bill kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, all of them, 100%.
yeah.
Who was it who famously said that a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich?
Right,
Right.
the New York Supreme Court Justice, yes.
So some of it, I think, is political stuff. You can be in a small town like this, you can be in a city, and it's patting of backs that goes on.
Yes.
Well, we're gonna get this guy because we can, or we're gonna get, there's a reason, or somebody's looking for a promotion, or there's all sorts of politics, I believe, in the system that ends up making for not a very fair, possibly not a very fair justice system. And we have many more people now, and some of them are like cattle, and that's what's going on, in my opinion, in the prison systems.
The most
They're just boom, boom, boom.
The
Yes.
most powerful union in California is the California Prison Guards Union. They have a huge political influence, and it's in their best interest to incarcerate as many people as they can. We haven't even touched upon corruption and outright bribery.
Yeah,
When I lived in Aspen for 30 years, and in my youth I was a marijuana smuggler, and I'm talking about tractor trailers. We were getting, in the 70s,
from where to where? Did you go into Mexico?
I actually did do some stuff coming over the border.
Okay.
And in Aspen in the 70s, I don't know how many Coloradans remember this, Hunter Thompson, the author,
Yes.
ran for sheriff on a platform of no drug enforcement at all. They had about this time, they had a grand jury going on investigating drugs in Aspen. People I worked for were getting grand jury transcripts, I was told we bought off a federal judge in Mississippi, and I was told by another smuggler, that they were actually landing an airplane on Governor John Connolly of Texas's private strip. So the extent of corruption to
Yes.
people not in the know who are naive,
Yeah.
you tell stories and people don't believe you, probably. I know for sure they don't believe me, but I know it for a fact because I lived it.
Wow, that's first person, yes, sir.
You mentioned the political thing. Well, close to that is religion. And in Idaho, a contractor disputed, I guess within the first 20 minutes of being in the courtroom, the other attorney pointed at the person I was living with, the woman I was living with, and said, "Is that the person you're cohabitating with?" Within the first 20 minutes. This was Mormon country. In fact, everybody in the courtroom except me and her were Mormon. Beyond that point, I don't think I had a chance.
Right.
And I've read some books on, this topic, and I guess in a couple of places it was mentioned that the judge makes up his mind subconsciously or consciously within the first 20 minutes.
Well, I am a Mormon, and I find that offensive.
I'm just telling you
And I
what
think if
happened.
you made that anecdote about blacks, people would come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't mean to offend you, but I'm just telling you what happened, that's all.
Yeah, sometimes it's very difficult to describe the abuse, and we always got to keep in mind as bad as it is for, or was for my white collar, mostly white colleagues, the blacks had it 5 times worse.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Hispanics 3 times. It's just terrible.
Well, it actually opened my eyes in that respect. It gave me a taste of what it's like to be a minority.
Yes, sir.
Hey, what I get a kick out of is the fact that, from my background, is we would look at people where somebody would come before me charged with a crime, simple as DWI. And I would ask, did you drink a beer? Did you have a drink of beer? They'd say, yes. I said, were you arrested? Yes. So my belief was, you drank a beer, you drove a car, knowing it was against the law, and now you're busted, and now you're trying to get out of it. So where we came from, or where I come from, is basically like you, like the way you were convicted, is we look at them saying, you're here because you did something wrong. And we don't know what that was, but we will find out.
Right.
And sadly, in this place where I work, we had probably about 300 inmates or 300 court cases coming through. And it was a private type prison. And the whole thing was, we had to send all 300 every month into the system. And the people who I was working with, I had a client load of about 70 people every week. And I was supposed to talk to all 70 per week. And basically, it was part of the processing.
What was your role? Are you a lawyer?
No.
Probation officer or something like that?
Well, I was a counselor, I was a psychotherapist. And part of my job was to look at people and say, you committed a crime, now you're gonna pay for it.
Okay.
But what disturbed me and why I finally quit that system was, it was a private prison, and the more bodies we could process, the more profitable it was for us. And I was being paid 40-hour a week, but I only worked 2 days. And the whole thing was,
Yeah.
we processed people in that manner. And the funny thing was, my client load went from 17-year-olds to 70-year-olds. And every one of them was convicted of meth offenses.
Meth? Yeah, okay.
And most of the time, it could be like they bought a box of Benadryl and they were arrested.
Oh, yeah, the key ingredient, yeah.
So, but again, I come from a background where I believe in law and order, and I believe that anybody in the court system, anybody in the legal system, anybody arrested by a police officer, basically, they probably committed a crime. But the whole thing goes back to, there's always extenuating circumstances. And I had a friend who shot a woman, and everybody knew he shot her and killed her. But they couldn't convict him because they had no witnesses.
Right.
And 2 years later, he shot and killed another woman, but this time his grandson saw the crime. And the lawyer said to him, give me $10,000, you'll never see the inside of the prison. And my friend gave him $10,000 and he never saw the inside of the prison. But going back to, I also saw the system where prosecutors are just as overwhelmed by the numbers of people coming to the court system. And so they make deals and basically...
Assembly line.
Yes.
Yeah, they'd rather do the assembly line than seek justice. Yeah.
And so, listen to what you're saying is, I'm pretty sure that everybody you met in that prison made the mistake of admitting something that they should not have admitted to in the beginning.
Right. Right, you know, when I first got indicted, my lawyer explained to me that if I didn't cooperate, it was gonna be 30 years. And, you know, then he quoted numbers and, to defend. And he said, your only hope, actually, is to cooperate with these guys and, you know, tell them everything. Well, I get to prison and, you know, part of that epiphany process where, you know, I heard everyone else's story. Yeah, well, so many guys, I didn't, but so many guys in the early part of the process, you know, kind of like these examples you had. Yeah, they were drinking, or yeah, they served somebody underage, or, but did it rise to the level of incarceration? You know, I think so many of those people cry out for psychological treatment and you know, various forms of rehabilitative care, and not enough of that happens. Yes, yes.
Now, you said you were in a state of bankruptcy at the time all of this
Yes.
happened, so I wondered if you had if you were able to afford your own private defense or if you had a public defender.
No, I had actually I had private, high-priced defense attorneys. I had 3 of them, and I was thinking, well, we got to nip this in the bud. So my best shot is go with these guys with the big law firm. And
So that brings me to my question then. You offered a plea deal in this situation, is that correct?
right.
Okay, so was it your fear of the possibility of what you saw the system could do to you that caused you to accept a plea deal, or rather than to take your chances in court and to say, I am not guilty?
Right. That is the equation.
Okay.
Do I want to be, you know, I was 62. Did I want a 30-year stay, you know, in prison? Or could I get something shorter?
Did you feel like your attorneys were not listening to what you were saying?
Oh, absolutely. Not only that, they were lying to me. I'll give you one little incident. Actually, it was a huge thing. You know, the indictment said that I had committed 18 counts of embezzlement. And, you know, I kept explaining to my attorneys, and I also explained it in a proffer to the prosecutors, that no, those checks that I did write to myself were partial paybacks of money, my personal money that I was lending. And I wasn't an embezzler, I was a contributor.
Right.
And I don't know how many times. So anyway, I get indicted, and I'm thinking, you know, my lawyers aren't giving me the answers I want. And I'm thinking, you know, I'd like to get my hands on the grand jury transcript. And I can look at that and see what, because the bank statements, the same bank statement that they use for their side is the same bank statement I would use for my side.
Right.
And my lawyers said, and each one of them said this at different times, multiple times each person. No, you can never get a grand jury transcript. It's very rare. The stuff's supposed to be secret.
Yeah, unless you bribe somebody.
Yeah. Well, it turned out that 30 days after my indictment, The prosecutor, I didn't learn this until I got to prison. The prosecutor went to the judge and filed a motion to release, without me asking for it, this was before I started, filed a motion to release the grand jury transcript to me, so I could see it.
Yeah.
And there was a sentence in there, and it said, with the concurrence of defense counsel, Judge, we think you should release it. Well, these guys were lying to me, and they lied about other things too, but I thought they were, very astute. One guy was an ex-assistant U.S. attorney.
Yeah.
So.
My dad, what he was convicted of was grand theft, but he actually, what he was an embezzler. When I was 15 years old, Castro had just come to power in 1959, and my dad and I were smuggling American dollars out of Cuba because Castro put a lock on exporting dollars from Cuba. So my dad was a thief. He stole money.
You've lived an awfully interesting life.
I thank the Lord every day that I've lived an interesting life. Bottom line is he walked off with somebody else's $30,000. How that is an American crime, I don't know. Because the people he was a courier for were Cubans. He actually brought money into the country. But he had a politically ambitious judge and prosecutor. He did 3 years for nonviolent time. And my dad was a combat veteran of World War II. So, he led an example. He lived on the other side of the law, but he's a stand-up guy. He led a basically law-abiding life. He did 3 years for something he should have got probation for, But that had to do with the political dimension of a not uncommon phenomenon of an ambitious prosecutor and an ambitious judge.
Right.
Politically ambitious.
Yeah, no, and then, the young ones, they're thinking, they want to move up in the world. The young ones many of them are, waiting to be a judge.
They'll step on your neck to do it.
Yeah, and the way to get there is conviction, conviction, conviction. Not all of them want to be a judge, but I'll bet half of them have that on their mind.
You're speaking on the lack of justice in the justice system, and I'm so fortunate to have been disabused of those illusions by the time I was 16 years old.
Yes, yeah. I was a little bit cocky, thought I knew a lot more than I knew, and was kind of a law and order guy, although I never was a proponent of capital punishment. I always thought that was wrong for various reasons. Thou shalt not kill, and they get it wrong periodically, and the guy's dead. But, all that has changed. I've reshuffled the deck completely. So, yeah.
So what are you doing, besides writing your book, to be proactive in what you think the changes are that should be made?
Well, not so much directly, but what my thought is I want to have more, 1,000 more of these sessions, just like today, and just get the word out. If I go out and say, well, I'm with the Innocence Project, and which is a great organization, and try to espouse their values. I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with that because invariably, and I don't know what their code of conduct is or anything like that, but I'll bet you there's a couple of things I don't agree with. But if I do this sort of on a freelance basis, I can cite, some of the things I saw when I was in prison and then,
Sure. Well, unfortunately, there's too many people that believe what's written in the newspaper.
Exactly.
You know, they don't care enough to understand exactly what has happened with the case. They tend to believe hearsay, and they believe that the newspaper and whatever is said on TV is it. That
Right.
is 100% correct, and that everything else that they might hear doesn't apply.
Right.
And that's not true, because a great deal of what's written in the newspaper is very one-sided, and
But
leaves too lot to question.
you're preaching to the choir, but, you know, freedom of press is very, very important. We can't, you know, freedom of speech, we can't touch that. And what that basically means is freedom to lie.
Mhm.
But when we get into certain situations like the courtroom and the judicial system, the government people, the prosecution, should not be lying. If they hold us to that standard,
That's right.
they should not lie. And so you end up with these narratives that the government puts out. And then on the press side, you know, these newspapers are losing money and cutting back and thinning staff. And so they say there's investigative journalism, and I think in some cases there probably is. But I think in my case, the investigative journalism was just rewriting the press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I'm not alone.
Yeah.
It just happens.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the character Saul Goodman?
No, I'm not even sure if I heard that.
Are you familiar with the character called Saul Goodman?
Saul Goodman.
He's a TV
No.
character.
No.
Well, basically, he's a lawyer.
Oh, yes. Saul, the New Mexico Breaking Bad lawyer.
Would you have benefit better from someone like him than your lawyers?
Yes, I really do. You know, you know, the lawyers I met when I was in prison, they said the last place you want to go with these big firms that have all this business with the U.S. Attorney's Office. You want to go with somebody who's independent and is defending people all over the place. And
My dad told me he met a much better class of people in prison than he met outside of it.
well, some of that's true.
Higher socioeconomic levels, is what he said.
Yeah, no, I
mean, you're preaching to people who have been propagandized for their entire lifetime about this, and I expect most people don't believe you.
yeah, I get that feeling. You know, my close friends seem to buy into everything I tell them. And then you get a little farther out, and the next sort of grouping of friends, you know, they love me, but there's a little slippage. You know, okay, he didn't embezzle, but he did something else wrong. Everybody's guilty of stuff. He got caught. You know, I think there's a certain amount of that.
There's a terrific book called Never Cry Wolf. It's written by a Canadian Arctic wildlife biologist. He describes following the wolves above the Arctic Circle in his book. And he has a conversation there with a Russian wildlife biologist. And this was written at the time of when the Russians had their propaganda papers, Izvestia and Pravda, which guys our age would have heard of. And the American naively says to the Russian, he says, well, how do you guys know anything? Your papers are lying to you. And the Russian replies, well, yes, we're being propagandized, but we read between the lines. On the other hand, you people have Madison Avenue, and you don't even know you're being propagandized.
Yeah, boys, that's so true. And then the other thing that's sort of related to that is, you know, we think about North Korea and China and all, you know, all the people they've imprisoned, and you know, what the propaganda leads us to believe, oh yeah, they got to be way worse than the U.S. And they probably have much more primitive prison conditions than we do. But in terms of gross numbers of people incarcerated, we're the worst. We're the highest. China has, what, 3 times our population? And I think they're at 300 per 100,000 incarcerated. We're at 600 plus. And just that statistic, wait a minute, the US is the, you know, China, wrong, bad, you shouldn't be, you know, their immigrant crisis is the Uyghurs, is it the Uyghurs, or, you know, in the
Uyghurs.
in the western part of
Right, Chinese
China,
Muslims.
and now they're incarcerating them all to reprogram them and all that. Well, what do? You know, we do a lot of the same thing.
Considerably worse.
Yeah, yeah. So, yes.
They say that there's an estimate of 15,000 people in the United States that are incarcerated that are 100% innocent, but they believe that number is grossly underrated.
Right. There's my percentage is 10%. The Innocence Project, and they focus on capital cases, meaning, you know, murder.
Criminal, yeah.
And they say, because, you know, they've gotten a lot of, every year they get half a dozen, a dozen people off.
Mhm.
Of course, there's thousands out there.
Right.
And, well, it's not so much they get them off, they get them out of prison. You know, they're on death row. And their main focus is on DNA and misidentification, which is 75% of all exonerations are a result of misidentification.
Or like fraudulent DNA, like in California, where they were just contaminating the evidence, and they threw out a shitload of cases because of it.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, we had drug guys then, not too many of them, but, you know, DEA people, big city policemen, that, you know, they'd go out and arrest the drug guys, and they're
Steal money.
yeah, there's a bunch of money and there's a bunch of drugs. Well, half of it goes into the evidence locker, and half of it gets resold by these people, and they got caught.
This is turned to a small, interesting group. I'll tell you something interesting. I not only grew up in a criminal family, I probably grew up in the most corrupt city in America, which is Miami, which is virtually a foreign country. I had a really close friend whose father was a front man for the mafia. He was the owner of record of 7 major oceanfront hotels.
Thank you.
Hotels that were really owned by the mafia. And I can remember being a kid, and he had a part-time job when I was a kid. It was either parking cars or working, you know, in a hotel pool. So I was parking cars, and I can remember distinctly at the time knowing who these big-time mafia guys were, knowing who the big-time mafia hitmen were, and simultaneously having a friend in jail because he got 2 tickets for loud mufflers on his car.
Yeah. Yeah. Not only should the guy not be in jail, but putting him in with these, you know, these other people you describe is, you know, that's a bad thing.
Point of trying to make is they were walking around free,
Yeah.
and he was in the joint, you
Yeah.
know? So,
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Gerry, for.
Oh, okay,
for
yes,
sharing your-
yes, we,
Yeah, for sharing your book, for donating a book to the library, and I can't even imagine how that felt as that was going down, and you had to do that, but I'm glad you're still standing, and you survived it, and can share your story, because that really means a lot.
well,
So,
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.